May God bless your day, and may his blessings be upon your entire week as you listen to this. We are so glad you are joining us. Today we have a mission. We are stepping into one of the most intense, shocking, and widely referenced narratives in ancient history, Genesis chapter 19.
Right, and to really do this justice, we are relying on some incredibly rich source material today.
Yes, we really are.
We're pulling from the text itself, of course, alongside the comprehensive theological, linguistic, and historical analysis found in two major study Bibles. That's the Holman Study Bible and the NAA, or the Nova Almeida Actualizada. The context we get from these sources completely changes how you read the events.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we all know the broad strokes of this story. If you grew up around this text, you know the imagery of fire, brimstone, and a woman turning into a pillar of salt.
Exactly, the Sunday school version.
Right. But when you move past that surface level and look at the actual historical and cultural realities of the ancient Near East, you realize this isn't just a simple morality play. This is a profound, deeply uncomfortable psychological drama.
It really is. It's a masterclass in the escalating cost of compromise.
We are looking at the ancient codes of hospitality, the terror of mob violence, the deeply human tendency to hesitate in a crisis, and the horrific choices people make when they are driven entirely by fear.
It's a brilliant study of human psychology under extreme world-ending duress. And to understand the psychology, you really have to understand the power dynamics right from the opening scene.
Right, the setting.
Yeah, the narrative starts in the evening, and we find a man named Lot sitting at the gate of the city of Sodom.
That specific detail, sitting at the gate is so easy for a modern reader to gloss over. You might picture a guy just hanging out on his front porch watching the evening commute.
Right, just waving at neighbors.
Exactly. But historically, the city gate in the ancient Near East was the center of everything. It wasn't just a door and a wall. It was the town square, the marketplace, and fundamentally the civic courtroom. It was the place where the elders sat and where legal disputes were settled.
Spot on. The gate was the seat of honor and authority. So establishing that Lot is sitting there tells us something crucial about his trajectory.
He's not a newcomer anymore.
No, he didn't just move to this city and keep his head down. He has assimilated, he's climbed the social ladder, attained status, and become a prominent civic leader. He's potentially even a judge in a culture that the text has already established as profoundly corrupt.
He is deeply entrenched in this environment.
Very entrenched.
And while he is sitting in that position of authority, two visitors arrive. The text identifies them as angels, though they appear as men. Lot's reaction to their arrival is instantaneous and almost panicked.
He bows down to them.
Yeah, and forcefully insists that they come to his house to spend the night. They initially decline, saying they'll just sleep in the public square.
Which was a perfectly normal, expected thing for travelers to do in most ancient cities.
Right, but Lot practically begs them to get off the street.
His panic is completely justified, and it highlights a stark contrast that runs throughout this narrative. Lot is attempting to uphold the sacred duty of hospitality, protecting vulnerable strangers, while knowing full well that the city he helps lead operates on a system of complete predatory hostility.
He knows exactly what the men of this city do to vulnerable outsiders in the square after dark.
Yes.
He manages to get them inside his house, and the text notes that he prepares a feast for them, specifically baking unleavened bread.
Which is such a telling detail.
It is. Now, normally when we hear unleavened bread, we associate it with Passover or some religious ritual. But in this historical context, serving unleavened bread wasn't about a religious ceremony, it was about speed. Unleavened bread means you do not have the time to let the yeast rise. You are panic baking.
Panic baking, exactly. It paints such a vivid picture of the atmosphere in that house. It is not a relaxed, welcoming dinner party. It is a frantic, rushed effort to get these men fed, hidden, and secured behind locked doors as quickly as humanly possible.
There's a palpable, suffocating tension in the room.
Because Lot knows the clock is ticking.
And that tension shatters almost immediately. Before they can even go to sleep, the house is surrounded. The text is chillingly specific about the demographics of this mob. It says the men of Sodom, from the youngest to the oldest, all the people from every quarter, surround the house.
This isn't a rogue gang of criminals?
No, this is the total unified mobilization of the city's male population.
There is zero dissenting voice. It's a terrifying sociological detail that demonstrates how absolute the corruption of this culture had become. The entire society operates on this frequency of violence.
They call out to Lot, demanding he bring his visitors outside. They say they want to, quote, know them. Now, looking at the linguistics of the Hebrew text, this isn't about handshakes and introductions.
No, not at all. The Hebrew verb used here is yada. While its baseline meaning is to know, in this specific context, it is an aggressive demand for sexual violence.
Right.
But it goes beyond just physical violence. It's a profound assertion of dominance. In the ancient world, subjecting a defeated enemy or a vulnerable stranger to this kind of assault was the ultimate way to humiliate, conquer, and strip them of all humanity and status.
The mob is actively rejecting the fundamental human duty of safe harbor,
Exactly.
which forces Lot into a situation where he makes what is arguably the most jarring, horrific calculation in the entire text. He steps out of his house, shuts the door behind him to physically block the mob from his guests, and he tries to negotiate.
He begs them not to do this wicked thing.
And then he offers the mob his 2 virgin daughters instead. Reading that, it is morally repulsive. It completely stops you in your tracks.
It is repulsive. But understanding the cultural framework of the ancient Near East is the only way to make sense of why a father would even conceptualize that bargain.
How does that even happen?
Well, in that era, the law of hospitality was considered sacred to an extreme degree. When a guest came under the shadow of your roof, your duty to protect them was absolute. It superseded your own life, and tragically, in Lot's desperate mind, it superseded his own family.
It's a catastrophic failure of moral reasoning.
Completely.
He is trapped between the sacred ancient code of protecting a guest and the unthinkable sacrifice of his daughters. It shows a man whose moral compass has been completely warped by the toxic environment he assimilated into. When you are driven by sheer terror, trying to appease an irrational, bloodthirsty mob, your decision-making completely collapses.
He thinks he can negotiate with a chaotic evil by offering it a lesser compromise. But the mob's reaction proves that compromise is impossible. They completely reject the offer.
They actually turn their rage entirely on him. They mock him, essentially saying, "You came here as a foreigner, and now you want to play the judge." They threaten to do worse to Lot than they planned for his guests, and they surge forward to break down the door. The situation is completely out of control.
It's the definitive breaking point. Any illusion Lot had that he was a respected civic leader or that he could manage the corruption of his city from the inside is violently stripped away in that moment.
Just as the mob is about to smash the door in, the tone inside completely shifts. The angels intervene, they reach out, grab Lot, pull him back inside, and strike the entire mob with blindness.
A supernatural blindness.
Yes, but the sheer hostility of the mob is so consuming that the blindness doesn't even stop them. The text says they exhaust themselves groping around in the dark, still trying to find the door.
The irony there is so incredibly dark. Their literal physical blindness in that moment is a direct mirror of their spiritual and moral blindness.
Wow, yeah.
A supernatural intervention just struck them, and instead of pausing in fear or reconsidering their actions, their rage just drives them to keep feeling for the doorknob. They are entirely consumed by their own hostility.
The angels have seen enough, and they finally reveal the actual purpose of their visit to Lot. They tell him they have been sent to destroy the city because the outcry against it has grown so great before the Lord.
That word outcry is central to the theology of this text. The Holman analysis does a deep dive into the Hebrew word used here, which is gadol.
Gadol.
Yes. It means to be great, to magnify, or to increase. The usage of gadol indicates a long progression. The judgment on this city wasn't an arbitrary, sudden flash of divine anger.
It was building up.
Precisely. The sin, the violence, and most importantly, the cries of the victims had been accumulating. It had magnified and thickened over years until it reached a catastrophic tipping point. The outcry of injustice had finally become impossible to ignore.
So the angels give Lot a mandate. Gather anyone who belongs to you and get out. Lot rushes to his future sons-in-law. The men pledge to marry his daughters, and he frantically warns them that the city is about to be destroyed.
But they think he's joking.
They literally laugh it off as a bad joke.
Which perfectly illustrates the psychology of a fully desensitized culture. When people are completely entrenched in a reality where actions have no moral consequences, the sudden warning of absolute judgment sounds absurd. They use humor to deflect the reality of the threat, which is a very common human defense mechanism when faced with uncomfortable truths.
Dawn breaks, and we had a moment that I think is one of the most painfully relatable pieces of human psychology in the text.
The hesitation.
Yes. The angels are urgently telling Lot to take his wife and daughters and run so they aren't swept away in the punishment. But Lot hesitates. He lingers. He delays. Here's a man who just survived a mob attack, who knows the tipping point has been reached, who has angels explicitly telling him to run. And he hesitates.
Because leaving requires an immediate, total abandonment of his identity.
Huh.
We go back to him sitting at the gate. He had wealth, status, a home, a whole life constructed within that city's walls.
It's hard to walk away from that.
It is. The cognitive dissonance of leaving a comfortable but deeply toxic environment is paralyzing. Even when you consciously know a situation is destructive, the familiar is often much easier to cling to than the terrifying unknown of starting over with nothing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Lot is so paralyzed by this cognitive dissonance that he cannot physically make himself leave. The text says the angels literally grab his hand, the hand of his wife and the hands of his daughters, and they physically drag them outside the city limits.
What's fascinating here is how the theological commentaries frame that specific physical action. They describe that dragging as the ultimate display of divine mercy overriding human indecision.
Overriding human indecision.
Yes, from the NAA notes. The text explicitly says, the Lord being merciful to him. God's grace in this moment isn't a polite invitation. It's a forceful, active rescue of a family that is too paralyzed by their own attachments to save their own lives.
Once they are dragged outside, the angels give a very clear command. Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, and do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, lest you be swept away.
But the cost of compromise is still working on Lot.
Even outside the city, facing annihilation, he pushes back. He starts negotiating with the angels.
He completely rejects the instruction to go to the mountains. He pleads with them, claiming that if he goes to the mountains, some disaster will overtake him and he will die. His decision-making is still entirely governed by fear and a desire for comfort.
He wants an easier way out.
Right. He bargains to flee to a small nearby town instead, rationalizing that because it is small, it shouldn't be a big deal to scare it.
The angel actually grants the concession. The town is spared and named Zoar, which literally translates to small. Lot gets exactly what his fear demanded. And the moment he arrives safely in Zoar, the sun rises and the devastation begins. The text states, the Lord rained sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah.
There has been a lot of historical debate trying to pinpoint a specific natural disaster that could explain this, like a localized volcanic eruption or an earthquake.
Right, trying to find a scientific explanation.
Exactly. But the historical commentaries from the Holman Notes argue that the language of the text points directly to a targeted supernatural judgment. The phrasing emphasizes a devastating rain of fire and brimstone originating from the heavens, systematically leveling the cities of the plain and all their inhabitants.
We all know the iconic image of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt during this destruction. But looking at the geological reality of the Dead Sea Basin completely changes how you visualize that moment. It wasn't just a magical spell.
No, the geography provides a terrifying, realistic context. The region around the Dead Sea is uniquely rich in natural hyalite, which are massive salt formations.
So it's literally a landscape of salt.
Yes. The implication in the historical analysis is that when Lot's wife ignored the urgent warning, stopped, and looked back, lingering in her attachment to the doomed city, she was physically caught in the outer edges of this supernatural storm.
She didn't just transform.
Right. She was likely suffocated, encrusted, and buried by the falling, burning, sulfurous salt matter. Her physical death became a permanent, literal monument to her inability to let go of her past.
As that catastrophic event is unfolding, the narrative briefly shifts focus away from the valley. It cuts to Abraham, Lot's uncle. Abraham had previously stood before God and interceded, begging for the city to be spared if even a few righteous people could be found. Early that morning, Abraham goes back to that exact spot, looks down toward the valley, and sees dense smoke rising from the entire land, like the smoke of a massive furnace.
That view from the mountain ties the theological thread together perfectly. The text makes a point to state that when God destroyed the cities, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe.
He remembered Abraham, not Lot.
Exactly. When you look at Lot's actions, his assimilation, his horrific bargain with the mob, his hesitation, his constant negotiating out of fear, his own righteousness is deeply compromised. The rescue was heavily reliant on his covenantal connection to Abraham. It demonstrates the profound weight of intercession in the ancient worldview.
But the narrative doesn't end with Lot taking a deep breath in the safe, small town of Zoar. This is where we enter the final, incredibly dark chapter of this deep dive, because Lot's fear doesn't subside. He doesn't stay in Zoar.
He runs again.
Driven by sheer terror, he packs up his 2 daughters and abandons the town, fleeing into the exact mountains he had just begged the angels to save him from.
The irony is suffocating. He manipulated his way out of the mountains because he was terrified of them, only to let his unchecked fear drive him right back up into those desolate peaks. He takes his daughters and moves into a dark cave, completely severing his family from whatever remained of human society.
And that extreme isolation breeds a desperate, horrifying plot. The daughters are living in this cave, having just watched fire fall from the sky and annihilate everything they ever knew. When you analyze their psychological state, it is essentially a post-apocalyptic worldview.
Absolutely. From their vantage point in that isolated cave, looking out over a smoking, ruined valley, they likely believe the entire world had been subjected to a judgment similar to the global flood.
Right, like Noah's flood all over again.
Yes. They conclude that there are no men left on Earth to give them children. In their traumatized minds, the survival of the human race, or at least their family lineage, rests entirely on their shoulders. They feel they have zero viable moral options left.
So relying on the twisted logic of survival and trauma, they devise a plan. On 2 consecutive nights, they get their father blackout drunk with wine. The older daughter sleeps with him the first night and the younger daughter the second night. The text notes that Lot was so intoxicated he had no awareness of what was happening.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the historical analysis draws a very sharp, contentional parallel here. This scene is a direct echo of the tragic story of Noah right after the flood.
Ah, that makes sense.
In both narratives, you have a patriarch who survives a massive, world-altering divine judgment, only to immediately compromise himself through excessive drunkenness, resulting in a shameful, devastating family incident. It's a recurring motif in ancient literature, highlighting how rapidly humanity stumbles, even in the immediate aftermath of salvation.
Both daughters become pregnant from this deception. The older daughter gives birth to a son named Moab, and the younger gives birth to Ben-Ami. Now, the Bible doesn't pause to deliver a moral lecture right there in the paragraph, but the ancient Israelite audience reading this wouldn't have needed one.
No, they inherently understood the deep, grievous sin of this act, but it's the historical lineage that really drives the tragedy home.
The origins of those nations.
Right, because this is an origin story. Moab becomes the patriarch of the Moabites, and Ben-Ami becomes the patriarch of the Ammonites. For the original readers of Genesis, these weren't just random names. The Moabites and Ammonites would grow to become some of Israel's most bitter, persistent geopolitical rivals throughout their history.
Israel's future enemies were literally birthed out of a toxic cocktail of fear, extreme isolation, drunkenness, and the terrible decision-making that happens when people compromise their values to survive. It is the ultimate tragic footnote to Lot's life. He begins this narrative sitting in a place of honor, power, and authority at the city gate. And he ends the narrative huddled in a dark cave, a blackout drunk, completely oblivious to the generational darkness his fear has just set into motion.
It's a devastating fall.
It really is. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Why should we spend time analyzing this intense ancient history today? Because the core human struggles in this text haven't changed in thousands of years. This is a profound examination of how toxic environments and unchecked fear compromise our ability to make sound decisions.
Human nature remains the same.
Look at Lot's trajectory. He slowly assimilated into a destructive culture until he was numb to it. When the crisis hit, he compromised his own family to try and appease an irrational mob. When he was told to leave, he hesitated because the toxic reality he knew felt safer than the unknown. And ultimately, he let his fear drive him out of a place of safety and into complete isolation, which led to generational tragedy. It forces you to look at your own life and ask, where is fear driving you into a cave? What toxic environments, relationships, or habits are you hesitating to walk away from simply because they feel familiar?
That's powerful. And it raises another important question, especially when we look back at the concept of the great outcry, that Hebrew word gadol.
The accumulation of cries.
Yes. The destruction we analyze today wasn't random. It was the result of an accumulation of injustice. The cries of the vulnerable reaching a breaking point that demanded a response. If that was true then, the provocative question for us today is this: what are the silent outcries in our own modern communities? What injustices, what cries for help are currently gathering strength and magnifying in our own cities that we might be completely blind to because we, like Lot, have assimilated into the noise? And what warnings are we hesitating to act on before that tipping point is reached?
That is definitely something to sit with and explore on your own this week. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We appreciate you taking the time to unpack this complex history with us. God bless all listeners.